Hello, everyone. I want to go over the elements of the presentation. That everybody will be giving. You'll be presenting your paper. So when you give a talk in the scientific world, when you're giving a talk on a paper, a scientific paper, you say you're giving a paper. Basically, you're giving a summary of the paper. There are some things in the paper that are not going to be in your presentation, some some formatting type of things. You're not going to have a page, a whole slide with literature cited all in it. But for the most part, it is a summary of your paper. The presentations are challenging to create because it requires you to summarize your paper. On the other hand, they're actually quite rewarding because you can actually communicate more visually with your audience instead of readers. It's an audience, and you can point specifically at things. You can engage the audience in different ways, whereas the paper is just kind of black and white on a screen. So anyway, there's a couple of things here. I'm going to use an example from a previous semester. I've taken the names off. You won't know who actually created the presentation. I found one that was good, and but it was a good presentation, but it was some elements took away from its effectiveness. And so I'm going to point out those things and point out the things that were really, really especially good about it. And then in general, it'll be a good example of what goes into a paper and creating goes into a presentation and creating that. Couple of things on your under research projects. Here, there is the guidelines for the paper, rubric for the paper, rubric for presentations. So rubric for the paper here. Here are all the different parts of the paper. And so the different slides are going to be different parts, going to correspond to different parts of your paper. Presentation, this is the presentation rubric. So what I do when I'm evaluating or when the peer evaluators is evaluating your presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to generally follow along. And when something is not quite right, when something takes away from the effectiveness, I'm going to note that, and it's probably going to be somewhere in here. What I'm not going to do is be able to keep track of every single one of these elements of a presentation. Looking down at this is not something. It's not really a grading sheet. I can keep looking down and looking up at. Instead, I already have a feel for what goes in here, what is here, and I'll just note things that are an issue, and I'll write something out here to the right-hand side of it there. Otherwise, if I don't say anything about, for example, if it really does look like the speakers practiced their talk and had good command of their material, then I'm just not going to. I'm not even going to put a check mark there. It's just there was no issue there. This also, though, should be used as not as a guide for creating a presentation, but just after you've got it pretty much made, look through this rubric and just sort of check it off yourself, see how well your presentation matches up with what you see here. I do not expect everyone, I expect most students in this class have not yet given a scientific presentation. I'm assuming they have not. But this will be practice. You just gotta, to be good at giving a scientific presentation, you got to get practice. This is practice. You got to start somewhere. So that's what we're going to do. And it'll be good for us in the class to hear about a topic that you have researched. Okay, so what else? Another thing about it is this is the presentation schedule here, starting Wednesday. Notice over here, peer reviewers. So, for example, I've given each team a number. And so we're going to start off teams number 2, 7, and 10. And then each individual collaborator in team 1, 2, and 6. Make sure I got that. Actually, that should be 1, 3, and 6. 1, 3, and 6 will review. So starting Wednesday, those of you in team 1 here, Emma, Hannah, and May, you will review, each of you individually, this talk right here, and so on down the line. So every student individually reviews another presentation. The idea there is that you'll get even a better understanding of what goes into presentation by critiquing somebody else's. However, I'm the only one that grades the presentations. I'll ask you for your evaluation of it, but I do the actual grading. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at an example presentation. This was a presentation last year somebody did on a species of plant it's an orchid, as you can see there. And what I'm going to do is go through this presentation and point out the good things and the things that were that again worked against its effectiveness. Let's put it that way. There was nothing terrible about this presentation. There was a lot that was good about it. It was one of the better ones. And so hopefully this will be helpful to you. Just some things to note along the way. I'm also going to note aesthetic things, even though I'm not really going to count you off for aesthetics unless it distracts from the presentation. First of all, though, I do want to point out one thing, though. This paper and this talk had a lot going for it. However, that title doesn't cut it. Title is just simply the study organism. That's not what this is not what the paper was about or the presentation was about. Presentation were about methods for conserving the species. So that title is not specific enough. So I would give that title like a 2 out of 5. So I'm not sure what happened there. Anyway, though, I do want you to notice, though, is I took off the author's names. They would be on there. But notice they have a photo here of the species. And then here's the URL here in small font below it. So it doesn't distract from the picture. And so you kind of already now the audience, they see this is about plants. This is about an orchid. There it is. Okay, I have a visual of it. This is going to make it easier for me to understand. As far as choosing backgrounds, you can just look up backgrounds for Google Slides, and just see what you can pick one. But and I don't really care which one you pick. Whatever you think is attractive. There's different ways to do it. But I do notice that you go to the next slide here, and it's a different background. So that's not good. You want to stick with the same background. Anyway, now we're going to start the part of the presentation where there's general information. Now, here's a point where a lot of people go into too much detail about the species or the system, whatever they're studying, eelgrasses or whatever. Their audience just needs to know just enough to be able to understand the methods that you're going to talk about later. There's infinite amounts of information on every species and system out there. You certainly don't want to just go over that. It may not be important. The color of the species may not be important. Sometimes even the distribution might not be important. Oftentimes it is. But pick out what do you as the audience, can you imagine you as the reader needing to know in order to understand the methods. But here's some general background here. They're communicating. And I should say here, I should say something here that's missing. Well, sort of missing. So they start off here not talking about this small world Pagonia. That's good. So they're going. I assume this slide here is the general sort of framing. I'm going to put a comment here. Is this the general framing of the study? I don't know. So orchids are generally important. I think that's a pretty good. I think orchids are the most common, most speciose plant family there is, plant order family, largest family of flowering plants. Many are in danger or threatened. Okay, so I guess this is about this general context. This is about orchids, many of which are of conservation concern. That's fine. Why conserve orchids? And here it's just really good. They show it's good to go ahead and show a graph or a figure from a paper, and you can see here. Notice right here we have the couple of sources. Notice it's not the whole citation written out; it's just the authors, and then date, as if you were citing it in the text of a paper. And then here's the URL for where they got this figure from. Presumably it's one of these papers here, but obviously it's from a paper, copy pasted here. Why conserve orchids? And I presume now that at this point here, the presenter talked about this. But one thing to note is when you show a figure like this, is the audience is not going to be able to see the details of this. So if some of these details here are important, you need to point them out. And either way, when you show a figure, you need to physically point it out. All right, so I don't know, I don't remember what they were trying to illustrate with this graph here, but you need to physically point it out. Go up to the screen and point at it, or use a pointer or something. Or maybe you have an arrow or something pointing there. I would say here, one thing I would have done here on this presentation was move this over here, and then put some text over here. I'd have some text right over here, which summarizes what I'm verbally saying. So that's what's missing on that slide. Next slide. And then we're going to learn something about the ecology of the species, because that's going to be important. And here it is summarized. Notice this is a summary of what the speaker is saying. However, it's highly summarized. So what good does this do? What does this do? Well, when I'm telling you some details about a species, it's good to have for the audience to have a mental placeholder to be able to glance at while I'm listening. So ideally, people in the audience are watching you, they're listening to you, they're watching your lips move, and they're listening to you and occasionally looking at slides. That's actually a problem with having slides that have a lot of stuff going on, is now the audience is more looking at the slides and maybe even being distracted by the slides, and they're not listening to you. Ideally, you want them to listen to you, and then what the text does, the summarized text, is it's a mental placeholder. So it's a different part of your brain. You're listening to somebody and internalizing what they're saying, and looking at something, a digital screen like this. That's a different part of your brain. Ideally, you come to a better understanding when you use different parts of your brain. Anyway, you need to have, it also kind of helps the audience keep track of what you said. So presumably here they were talking about the ecology, and there's far more details coming out of their mouth of the speaker at this point than what you see on the slide, which is good. I would probably make this figure larger. You can sort of cut and paste and then expand it. We can see the distribution better. What else? It's not shade tolerant, it self-pollinates. I suppose that's important. Actually, I think it is important, self-pollinates. And then, well, here's a nice thing. So they showed, notice how every night, this is something really important. Every slide has an illustration. Every slide has an illustration. But it's got to be more than just a picture of the species. So if all they did was just show a picture of the species, that might not be so good. Maybe actually in this slide, it might be okay. But what they're doing here, this picture is showing here is, I'm not really sure what the picture is showing. Maybe it's showing habitat. But just make sure whatever picture you show here illustrates the thing you're communicating. If your talk was about tigers, don't just put a pretty picture of a tiger every other slide, because that doesn't communicate anything. We know it's a tiger. You need to have a visual which the audience can absorb while they're listening to you. Again, I'm not sure what this slide shows here. Yeah, I'm just going to say, not clear what this slide shows. This figure is showing a person and sort of a forest, sort of a cutover forest. Conservation history. Now, again, you should, as part of your paper, you communicate. It may just be a sentence or two to communicate the conservation history and the conservation status of the species or the system. And it may not be a conservation concern. It may just be an invasive species, for example, in which case you're not talking about conservation history, you're talking about management history. But anyway, here it is. And here's a little graph here that shows the timeline for the delisting goal. It was downlisted at one point as a delisting goal. Anyway, it's listed as threatened in the US, vulnerable under the IUCN. There's the citations right there. Most recent recovery plan was published in 1992. That's a pretty old recovery plan. Here we go, threats. What are the threats to it? Urbanization. That's a nice picture there showing urbanization. Then they say soil degradation and environmental stochasticity. And then I'm not sure what this is showing here, just other things. But notice there's no other slides. What I would do here is make copies. Go Control D, I think. Make copies of these slides here. Use the same slide, but put a different figure in there, which illustrates the next thing, soil degradation. And then have another slide, and then maybe it illustrates environmental stochasticity. I'm not sure what that would be. See, it doesn't take to sit on one slide and talk about all these things. It doesn't take any less time than just taking the same slide, make a copy of it, and have a different picture as you're moving down the list of things. See what I mean? Yeah, you're adding more slides to your talk, but more slides to your talk doesn't add length to your talk. If they're all the same slide, just a slightly different picture. You use that. So I would have a different picture there. Now notice how they changed font sizes here. That's generally just as far as aesthetics go, that's not a great thing to do. Let's just stick with one size font. Now we're going to get into, I wasn't sure whether this is one of the methods they assessed. Notice also they just kind of launch right in from the background into like talking about designation of wildlife. So did you at some point in your presentation, are you going to tell us what you're going to do in your presentation? Then you need to do that in some way. I'll leave it up to you how you want to do it, but you need to communicate that. But here now we're getting into some of the details here. Designation of wildlife protected areas and what is involved in that. And that's what we see right here. Notice again the citations. And this is continued here. This is going to talk about some of the, I guess, more sort of background here on methods, I guess. I can't remember exactly what the details were, but here we're getting into, actually shows results. So you're studying methods. Methods have details of how they work, but also you want to be able to communicate in your paper, in your presentation, what happened when those methods were tried. And notice here, there is some of that. Stem growth and seed production. Control group showed little improvement. Stem growth and seed production. I'm not sure what was being communicated here, but it looks like you're seeing here is the results of a study. I'm really glad they showed quantitative results here. However, the audience is not going to be able to see these labels here. So you're going to have to physically talk about what this graph is showing. Okay, you're going to have to physically point out and say what it's being illustrated. This is a figure that's just missing here. I don't know why, but so whatever it was they were talking about, you need to physically point to the important things in this quantitative figure here. Otherwise, again, we cannot interpret. The audience cannot interpret this. They cannot absorb this. Now we have a method. So we went from, I don't know if was that a method? This is a method. So now we're talking about a method, which is this ex situ conservation method involving transplants. And I think this is just sort of in general what the role of botanical gardens is in that. That's what they're talking about. That's what's communicating here. And that's a really nice couple of illustrations for that. Again, look at the citations here and the URL. Now we're getting into more methods here. Ex situ conservation. There's two types of propagation, and this is what's being shown right here. So that's good. I don't remember the details of this, but those look like really good figures for illustrating these methods. Pick good figures. It may be hard to find them. You may have to make them yourself. Here we have a table. So feel free to show a table or copy paste a table. But also notice here that they've highlighted here. You can do that by insert like boxes and whatever you want. You can just play around with Google Slides. You can just it's like PowerPoint or anything else. It's pretty familiar. It's like Word, Microsoft, but notice they've highlighted certain aspects of the relevant parts of these results that are shown here, and you're going to talk about them. But again, though, do not expect your audience to be able to read this table caption, for example, or absorb this. Just direct their attention to one thing. I would actually think it would be better here to actually have this table be sort of smaller and have some text over here and just talk about it there. Pros and cons of this method, and these pictures here illustrate that. There's not much information here, and you don't want to overwhelm the reader or the audience with information. On this other hand, you don't want to be too brief, so I'm not really sure. I think this is probably, I'm going to put this here as a comment. Good to summarize, but do not summarize too much. A little more information than that. I'm sure they were talking about a lot of stuff here, and just having one word, that's probably not good enough. Inexpensive is pretty obvious what that means. What is unlimited? I guess, I don't know. You might need to expand a little bit. Don't be too, but don't write too much. Think about the audience. Do they have time to actually read and absorb? It's a mental placeholder. Maybe that was enough, but probably not. Here's another method using GIS for in situ conservation. And so that's what they're going to talk about here. I'd make this figure a little larger, perhaps. But anyway, it's probably describing what GIS does, the way it works, and what it means to make predictions using GIS. And then here's some more illustrations of that. Again, here is a citation here, and here's a URL showing presumably where this came from. Oh, no links available. Screenshot. These are a screenshot from a paper. Screenshot from that paper. That's fine. I would just. So the speaker is talking about what's being shown here. And then the pros and cons of that. You don't have to say pros and cons. You could say you don't even have to say, you could just set it up. I don't know. You don't have to be, I'm not saying there's a set structure you have to follow, but generally the one way to illustrate or to communicate details of something is to talk about the positives and negatives, the challenges, the rewards, that kind of thing. Kind of a push and pull, but this, or maybe an example. Anyway, something to sort of, again, kind of something for the reader to be able to, the audience to be able to sort of engage better with what it is you're talking about. And oftentimes, the pro-con way, sort of pitting one against another, or talking about the challenges, rewards, that's a good way for the audience to sort of grab hold of that and be able to follow it. And then, future conservation needs. So this is going to come out of what your assessment is from looking at the literature, and presumably in some of those papers, the authors have pointed out that here's what's needed. Here's the research that needs to be done. Here's the conservation strategies that need to be attempted. And so you've already talked about the methods you use. Now what? Try not to make this, it can't just be just a summary of what you've already talked about. Oh yeah, we need to do all those things and, do them all. You need to go do more than that. Surely in some of those papers you looked at, the authors have, in the discussion, somewhere down the discussion has said, and here is what's, they've communicated, here's what's we need to do in the future. Or find that information from somewhere. And notice here, what they're talking about here, there are citations here. So this information is coming from some sources. And then finally, Rickson, they may make some recommendations. You don't have to make specific recommendations. It's a good thing to do if you can. Maybe you really just can't do that. Maybe you just have some conclusions about where we need to go from here. This is more the example of a specific recommendation, but this is, again, it's another example where maybe technology as a word is too brief. You need to expand that out a little bit, have a few more words to communicate what it is you're saying here. And then there are the sources. So notice this talk does not end with the literature cited. You don't have a literature cited slides. We just don't do that in the sciences. For one thing, who wants to read that? You don't need an acknowledgments, although that's a common part of a presentation, but you don't need one. So I hope this has been helpful. I guess I will make this presentation available to you all if you want to. But again, though, I'm not holding this up as a great example. It's a good example. It's got some problems, but maybe it'll be helpful to you.